This is God's Hand in History, brought to you by Mr. Mac.
This is Mr. Mac for God's Hand in History. This is our fourth podcast. No, this is a third podcast. We'll get to a fourth one in a minute, but this is the third podcast, and we're talking about miracle number 2. Fourth podcast? I was right in the first place. My technical advisor says it is the fourth podcast, and we'll keep going there. Don't have to edit. And we're going to talk about miracle number 2, which is a redirection of the Mayflower. So one of the things that we need to think about is every time there's a miracle, it's God directing, guiding, making sure that we got one nation under God. As the Christians in Holland got word of the colonization of the British on the new continent, they agreed that they needed to sail there to be free from the oppression that was going on in Europe. Even when they were in Holland, they were being oppressed. And they said, we need to be able to get to this new land. We know that people are in Jamestown. They've established that we've got a whole continent over there that's unexplored. Maybe we've got a place there that we can plant the Christian doctrine. They were able to acquire 2 ships, the Mayflower, which was actually anchored in Britain, and the Speedwell. And they said they needed to put in, the owner of the Speedwell said, you need to put in stronger masts and larger sails if this ship is going to be able to go in the ocean. So they had the Speedwell altered. The people that were there, the ones, we'll call them the Puritans. The Puritans loaded up on the Speedwell, sailed across to England to gather together with the people that were ready to get with the Mayflower, so they'd go in both ships and go across the ocean. They loaded up both ships and they set out into the Atlantic. When they got out a little ways, all of a sudden the Speedwell realized they're taking on water like crazy. They had to turn around. They were out, a long way from the shore, sailed all the way back to England, fixed it, caulked all the cracks and tried to get it fixed. They set out again. When they set out again, the same thing happened. It happened 3 times. Every time they would turn around with the Mayflower and come back to England. Now it was kind of a mixed group, by the way. They had not only the Puritans, but there were some average people who wanted to come along and colonize. But now they realized this Speedwell isn't going to make it. So now we've got to cut down on the number of people who are going. So there was a reduction in the number, which meant that only a select number, mostly Puritans, were able to come. They basically abandoned the Speedwell and decided to set off with really overpacking the Mayflower. Off they went across the ocean. And now as they went over there, let me just kind of make a side note here. The fellow that sold the Speedwell to the Puritans, not going to make judgment about his character, except he came in and bought the abandoned Speedwell back again, took off the big mast, put on the regular mast. It seemed like he knew that by putting on the bigger mast, it would stress the hull and make it leak. This way, he was able to sell the ship for his regular price and then get it back for a reduced price, still have his ship. He continued working the Speedwell. But what it really did, and this may have been, who knows, was it Satan trying to delay the Puritans? We don't know, but we do know that the select number that God wanted was on that Mayflower. Now, they sat out across the ocean, and they were headed for Jamestown. But God knew that he wanted someplace different. When they got out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, he sent a huge storm. This storm drove the Mayflower north, went way beyond where Jamestown was, went way up into what John Smith had written back and called New England, which was all the area which is north of basically what is New York now. And so as they came in the dead of winter into the coast along the lower end of Maine, New Hampshire, and up into Massachusetts, they came into the harbor of Massachusetts, and they landed there instead of in Jamestown. And here They were in a place where the Spanish wouldn't threaten them, so that was an advantage. They didn't have the conflicts that Jamestown would have between those people who were merchants and were there for commerce and which ones it might be for Christianity. They were at a place where even the Indians, there had been a reduction in the number of Indians there because of the people who were the fishermen that came along the New England coast by landing and trading with the Indians had passed on some diseases which really reduced the size of the tribes that would be there to confront them. In fact, the chief was Powhatan, had gone from maybe 2,000 in the tribe down to maybe 200. It was a huge reduction, so the threat to the Pilgrims was less. And they established their continent, their colony there, based purely on biblical principles, not on anything else. Now, God had planned for this ahead of time. How do we know? Because back several years ago, there was a young Indian boy, Indian youth, was captured up somewhere not far away from where they landed. He was captured by the Spanish fishermen, and he was taken as a slave and sold down in Spain to a Spanish priest. Spanish priest bought him, but he taught him how to speak Spanish and to get along with Europeans. He taught him Christianity, and then he freed him. And this man's name was Tesquanto, later known as Squanto. And so after he freed him, Squanto became a sailor on a British ship, and that British ship now again sailed up along the New England coast about the time that the Mayflower landed. Squanto got the ship. He says, "Goodbye, I'm no longer a sailor." He traveled down from southern Maine, came down and met with the colonists, and this is at a time when the colonists needed to have an accord with the Indians that were there. The Indians and they weren't sure about how they're going to get along, and it just so happens, another one of God's coincidences, that Squanto happened to be a member of the tribe where Powhatan and that group was confronting the colonists. Squanto then becomes their translator. He becomes the middleman, the go-between to bring the colonists, the Indians together. One more positive thing to establish that nation as one nation under God with a godly government. And only God could have done such a thing. So we're going to talk about miracle number 3. Miracle number 3. Next week, this is Mr. Mack for God's Hand in History, and we'll see you next week to talk about miracle number 3. God bless you. Have a wonderful week.